welcome everyone in the room and welcome people online. No idea how many people there are online, but welcome. So my name is Esther van Sluis. I am the program leader for the Behavioral Epidemiology and Interventions in Young People program here at the MRC Epidemiology unit. So I'm very pleased to be welcoming Dr. Samuel Dumith.
Yes.
I practice his name here. Samuel is a professor of biostats at the Faculty of Medicine at the Federal University of Rio Grande, which I understand is in the south of Brazil. You've only come over this weekend, so I hope it's not too cold here. So he trained in physical education before moving to studying epidemiology for his master's and PhD. And you did your PhD in Pelotas working with Pedro Halal, amongst others. He's an epidemiologist with a focus on physical activity research, mainly observational research, and also work around how to best measure physical activity. But moving to thinking about interventions at the moment, and that's partly why you're here this week. Actually, lots of the research our group does is informed by some of the papers you have written, and I particularly think about a review you wrote, I think as part of your PhD, actually estimating the amount of change that happens in physical activity during adolescence, and that was really a step up for us to start working on the Go Active grant. So thanks very much for that work. And he most recently also contributed to the development of the first Brazilian physical activity guidelines. So your talk today is about physical activity research and about how we can strengthen the ties between Brazil and the UK. So I look forward to hearing your talk. I'll give you a sign at about 45 minutes, if that's gone. And yes, think of questions during the talk.
Okay, Dr. Lester, thank you for the invitation to present this seminar. Good afternoon to everybody. I apologize for my poor English, my bad English, but I hope that you can understand me. Starting the presentation, I came from Brazil, and
yeah, just quickly.
okay, I came from Brazil. I don't know if you have been there, but it is about 12 hours by plane from here, this journey. And I will be here on this week, as Professor Esther told you. I am available to talk with you in this week. And I'm here to make some collaborations in study projects and in some papers. And I'm here also to learn with you and to share my knowledge with you. I have to make a special acknowledgement to Professor Dr. Esteban Sluis that accept my coming to here and promptly accept my coming to here, and to Dr. Luisa Isnard Ricardo that gave me all the support I need to be here today. This is the outline of my presentation. First, I will talk about my most important published papers that I select to present to you. So I will talk a little bit about some papers under review, and finally about one paper that is under review. This is my most cited paper that have almost 1,000 citations in the Web of Science database and more than 1,000 citations in the Google Scholar database. I think this paper put my name in the International Seminary of the Epidemiology of Physical Active in the world, and this is and in this paper we showed that the physical active has a decrease in the adolescence of about 7% by year. I wrote this paper with the collaboration of Dr. Dumith during my PhD study. This is my first paper, my first published paper that was that I wrote during my master in science. And this paper was published in the International Journal of Behavioral Nutrition and Physical Activity in 2007. That was when this journal was beginning. And in this paper, we found that almost 40% of individuals, adults and the older individuals in Brazil were in the pre-contemplation stage. This means that those people were physically inactive and they do not have the intention to become active. Almost at 50%. Then, in the end of my PhD, I wrote this another paper that was the most comprehensive paper about physical inactivity estimates in the world so far up to then. This was published in the Private Medicine in 2011. And this was, I made a pooled analysis of 3 multicenter studies published between 2002 and 2004 that used the same instrument to measure the physical activity. That was the International Physical Activity Questionnaire in its short form that encompasses the 4 domains of physical activity: leisure time, commuting, working or occupation, and the domestic. In this analysis, we comprised about 300,000 individuals aged 15 years or more from 76 countries. And the weight prevalence of physical inactivity was 17%, ranging from 2.6 in Comoros to 62% in Mauritania. This is a map that we published in this paper, illustrating the physical inactivity prevalence around the world. And this is the analysis I conducted to establish the association between the physical activity with the Human Development Index. So we can see that it was a positive association between the prevalence of physical inactivity with the HDI, where the most developed countries presented the higher prevalence of physical inactivity, considering the 4 domains of physical activity. This paper gave the origins to that paper that was conducted by Professor Pedro Alau. And this is a part of the Lancet series published in 2012. And this is a more complete analysis of the physical activity levels in the world. So after the publication of my paper, he worked on this another paper using my paper as a base for this study. Then after my doctorate, after my PhD, I started to supervise some students in Brazil. In my doctorate, I had an experience in working in Austin, Texas, doing an exchange there with Dr. Dumith, and then I returned to Brazil. And I started to work in my university since 2011 up to then. So for the last 12 years, I am a professor and researcher in this university. And I started to supervise some students. And I had to collect data for these students, have material to do their theses and dissertations. And one of my first my first own project was about the influence of the environment on physical activity. First, we studied the influence of the perceived environment on prevalence of physical activity, and we did it by means of IPAC, and the environment was measured by the neighborhood environmental walkability scale. And we concluded that the high prevalence of physical activity was associated to social support, take walk with their dogs, and safety of the neighborhood. This is a three factor among the other many factors investigated that present an association with physical activity prevalence. Then I followed this project, studying the influence of the built environment on the physical activity level among adults and the elderly in southern Brazil, where I live. And in this study, we shall reference the households with a half-kilometer buffer, and we found a few associations between the built environmentals with the variables with the PA practice. Just the proximity to the sea and the presence of private gyms or sports clubs were associated to higher pay level, among many other variables studied. So in 2020, I started to work in this important project that was the construction of the physical activity guidelines for the Brazilian population. Until then, we did not have national guidelines. We used to use the guidelines from the US that was more famous. But we think it was necessary to have our own guidelines. So we made the efforts to construction these guidelines for the Brazilian population. And I will talk in a few minutes about the construction of these guidelines, this document. That is an important publication for us in Brazil. This is the timeline of the physical activity field in Brazil, and I highlight the foundation of the Brazilian Journal of Physical Activity and Health in 1995. Then in 1997, it was we held the first edition of the Brazilian Congress of Physical Activity and Health, first then the International Congress of Physical Activity and Health, and the Journal of Physical Activity and Health as well. And in 2007, we have the founder of the Brazilian Society for Physical Activity and Health. So this is some important points of the history of the physical activity in Brazil. And in 2021, we published the physical activity guidelines for the Brazilian population. This is a workflow of our construction of these guidelines. That started on March of 2020 and was concluded on January of 2021 with its publication. And we have published two important papers regarding these guidelines that can be found in the Journal of Physical Activity and Health, published in 2022. The first paper approaches I'm sorry, yes. The first paper approaches the methods for the creation of the guidelines, and the second paper approaches the recommendations report. We have made recommendations for 7 age groups that are the children up to 5 years old. I will not read these recommendations because we encourage many recommendations of other guidelines the world, but we have made some other recommendations that you can see in our guidelines that is published in Portuguese, Spanish, and in English. And we have made recommendations as well for children and youth from 6 to 17 years old, for adults from 18 to 59 years old, and for other adults of 6 years old or more. We have also made recommendations for the physical education at school. This is a novelty of our guideline because it is not approached in other main guidelines, but we think it was important to have a chapter for this topic. And we had a chapter as well for the pregnant and postpartum women. So finally, we provide recommendations for people with disability. Then this is our guidelines, and I brought here another paper that was published in the Brazilian Journal of Physical Activity and Health, describing the process of construction of each chapter. I was a coordinator of one work group that worked on the recommendations for the children and youth. So we wrote each research group wrote a paper about the construction of their chapters, and published in this journal, this Brazilian journal, describing this process. First, each group conducted a literature review. Then we gave some examples of activities in each domains for each age groups. This is the guidelines for this age group that reinforces the recommendations from other guidelines, because our intention was not to make other recommendations, but to reinforce or make some adjustments. And this is a summary of some key messages for the children and the youth, for the parents or guardians, and for the physical education teachers, to stimulate the children and the youth to become more active. This is an important part of our guidelines. That was the provision of these key messages. And here we provide some key messages for reduce the time in sedentary behavior. Sure. Then when we start the construction of these guidelines, we have faced with the COVID pandemic, and we have to make some changes in our researches because the interest of the scientific community in the world was directed for the coronavirus pandemic. So at this time in 2020 and 2021, I worked in another project to study the influence of this pandemic on the mental health of the population. And I take advantage of this project that was funded by a Brazilian agency to study the influence, the effect of the pandemic on the physical activity level in Brazilian population. So I worked on this manuscript with a student in her PhD, and in this research we did a panel study comparing the prevalence of physical activity before the pandemic and after the pandemic. So we did made a data collection in person during the pandemic to study the physical activity level during the pandemic, and comparing with data that we had collected before the pandemic for the same population, but not for the same sample. This study included more than 4,000 individuals, adult individuals, and the PA was evaluated through the IPAC. And the factors that contributed the most to the PA decline during this period of about 5 years was the social distancing, the excessive search for information about the pandemic, and the fear of pandemic and the COVID-19 infection. So this was one of the first studies in Brazil to evaluate the influence of the pandemic on the physical activity level. And we note that the home office was a protective factor for physical inactivity. That, in other words, people that start to work at home were more active. This graph illustrates the physical activity changes before the pandemic and during the pandemic. And we can see that the most affected domain of physical activity was the community physical activity, that suffered a reduction of more than 70% in this period. And the prevalence of physical inactivity, that was the presence of any physical activity at all, increased more than 100% during this period of about 5 years. This is an interesting data. Another study that I have conducted with other colleagues and students during the pandemic was the influence of the COVID pandemic on physical activity among university students. This was a multi-center study with more than 5,000 students from Brazil, from 5 regions from Brazil, 5 universities in Brazil, aged 18 years old or more. We observed that almost 50% of the university students were physically inactive, ranging from 26 to 65 across these 5 universities. And the most associated variables with physical inactivity were the fear of pandemic, not the infection by pandemic, but the fear, and the isolation were the 2 most associated variables with physical inactivity. And also, as the previous study I present to you, have started work at home was a protective factor to be physically inactive. I think because these people had more time to do physical activity. So during the period of pandemic, I started to work with second data with my research group in Brazil, because it was difficult to gather original data during this period, the last few years. And an option to us was to maintain our publication and doing research, analyzing secondary data from Brazil and other countries. And this is a paper that we published with secondary data from the Digital Survey. Digital Survey is an annual survey in Brazil that have been done since 2006 to nowadays. And in this paper, it is not about mainly physical activity, but physical activity was an independent variable that we analyzed in this paper. But I saw that here in the MRC, there are people interested in obesity and diet and diabetes. So I suppose it was of interest to present this paper. And this is a table showing the annual percentage change of obesity in Brazil. And we can see that for the country as a whole, there was an increase of about 0.6 percentage points in the obesity during the last 15 years, since 2006 to 2019. And here is the distribution of this annual obesity growth rate for each state in Brazil. The regions that had the most increase was the North region, and the least increase is the South region. Besides of the time trends analysis that we made, we also associated these changes with some behavioral and contextual factors. And we verified that among these five variables, these five behavioral variables, the most one associated with the obesity increase was a physical activity practice that was inversely or negatively associated with the obesity growth in Brazil. And the most associated variables were the contextual variables that explained 81% of the increase of obesity in Brazil in this period from the past 15 years. This is the 7 most associated variables, and the most associated variable was the Gini coefficient that measures the inequalities in population. And this was directly associated with the obesity increase in Brazil. Other associated variables were the population without income and the population with low level of education. Another paper that we published using the secondary data of digital was about diabetes in Brazil. This is a time trend analysis from the same period, and we studied the change in diabetes in Brazil and made association with the consumption of artificially sweetened beverages. And this paper is submitted to the public health of the Springer, And our main results were that the prevalence of diabetes mellitus increased 50% in this period of 15 years, going from 5.5% to 8.2%, with annual growth, annual percentage change of 0.17 percentage points by year. And we also noticed that among those people who consumed the diet light or zero beverage, the annual percentage change of diabetes mellitus was 4 times greater. That's right. This is a cross-sectional study. We don't have the temporality of these events, but in many other studies from the literature, we found that the consumption of diet light or zero beverage can increase the incidence of diabetes. These evidence were extracted from cohort studies. So we can believe that the consumption of this type of beverages can be associated with the increase in diabetes mellitus in Brazil. And the population attributable risk correspond to this behavior in the occurrence of diabetes was 17%. In other words, this results means that if there is a cause-effect relationship between the consuming of artificially sweetened beverages and the diabetes, the suppression of these beverages in Brazil could reduce the annual percent change of diabetes from 0.17 to 0.10%. Percentage points by year. Thus, about 100,000 of new cases could be avoided if these beverages could be eliminated. This is another paper that we wrote. I wrote with my research group that approached the binge drinking and association with physical activity, more specifically the exercise and free time sports. This was a full analysis of more than 700,000 adults in Brazil, aged 18 years old or more. And we use data from digital as well, from 2006 to 2019. And this is almost accepted in the Journal of Physical Activity and Health. This received minor comments from the revisers. This is a graph illustrating the prevalence, the proportion of each modality practicing, physical activity practicing in Brazil. And the most practiced was the outdoor walking or running. That was practiced by about one among the 5 individuals. Then we have the team sports, strengthening, and other activities, modalities of physical activities. But half of the population did not were not involved in any type of physical activity. And when we cross this information with the prevalence of binge drinking, we can see that some types of activities are risk factor for higher drink in Brazil. And the most activities that were associated with binge drinking, taking account that its prevalence, the proportion of this activity in the population, and the prevalence of binge drinking that is in this graph, is the team sport and the strengthening exercise or gym exercise to gain strength. And for these two activities, we did an interaction analysis, and we saw an effect modifier by the frequency of practice of these activities, where the sporadic team sports were those who have more binge drinking, and the frequent strengthening activity were those who had more binge drinking as well. I have a paper under review regarding the trends and inequalities in total and leisure time physical activity, and using the data of the digital. And we did in this paper different analysis that was the jeopardy index. This is a composite index of vulnerability, considering in our study these three variables: sex, education, and skin color. And we concluded that the most vulnerable groups that were the group 4, this x-axis goes from 0 to 4, and this is the most privileged group, and this is the most vulnerable group. And here in the lines, we can see the prevalence of physical activity for all 4 domains and for the leisure time. And for this both analysis, we saw that there is a decrease in the physical active prevalence for the most vulnerable groups. For the total PA, it was about 25 points lower than for the most privileged group. And for the leisure time, it is about 30 percentage points lower between these extremes groups. I have another papers with second data from other countries, and I brought today to present 2 papers using data from UK. One of them approached the physical inactivity and association with incident depression in adulthood. And we used data from the 1958 National Child Development Survey that encompasses more than 17,000 births from England, Wales, and Scotland. And we had 11 follow-ups between age 7 and the age 62 that was carried out in 2020. And we analyzed the effect of being active in the childhood and adolescence at these 3 age points. Our main finding, we did a cohort regression, a survival analysis, and we found that the physical activity practice, physical inactivity at age 16 was a risk factor for the development of depressive symptoms during adulthood. So it is an interesting analysis showing this finding. The another paper that we published, I published with other colleagues, with the coordination of Nathan Fetter, a colleague from Brazil, is about the association of physical activity and dementia in older adults. And we used data from the English longitudinal study of aging, ELSA. The participants were over 50 years old and were followed between 2002 and 2019. And we analyzed individuals with mild cognitive impairment. So we conclude that PA minimizes the risk of dementia in older adults with MCI. And we did a cohort regression as well, and we can verify in this figure that the physical activity practice, independent of its intensity, was a protective factor for the incidence of dementia in older adults. And in this another graph, we can see interaction with age. So it is important to note that the the hazard ratio of dementia in people aged 80 years old or more that were physically active was the same of the individuals aged 50 years old to 69 years old that were physically inactive. They have the same hazard ratio to develop dementia, showing the protective role of physical activity. And finally, looking for new associations to do not the same of other papers or what is well established in the literature. We are looking for new possible associations, and I'm conducting a paper with original data investigating the possible association with physical activity and wisdom among the students, higher school students. And we found an interesting association with this score of this scale, the abbreviated San Diego Wisdom Scale that had 7 questions, with the prevalence of physical activity, where the active group had a score, mean score, on average 2 points higher than the inactive students, and categorizing this score in quartiles and dichotomized into isolating the last quartile. We found that the active students were about 2 times had 2 times more probability to have more wisdom, degree of wisdom. I thank you again for attending this seminar and for give your time to watch my presentation.